So hello and welcome to Caring in Crisis, the Tuesday Briefs, a part of the Trauma-Informed Faith Communities Project of Crisis Care Ministries. I'm Reverend Mary Hughes with Crisis Care Ministries, and we are so glad that you have joined us today. Great to see familiar faces as well as some new faces that are here as well. So we do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded. At the end of the hour, we will formally close the webinar and stop the recording. But if you'd like to stay for a little while, we'll open up the mics and be here for some more informal discussion. As you can see in the introductory slide rotations, you can find all things webinars, details about our schedule, our presenters, resources our presenters have provided, and some of the videos at crisiscareministries.net. Just click on the webinar hub at the top of the page. And a reminder that we update that website frequently, so you may need to refresh your page if you've been there before. We want to say a very special word of thanks to our funders and to those who are providing training and resources for the entire Trauma-Informed Faith Communities Project. We're so grateful for their support, their guidance, and really, we just couldn't be doing this project without them. Of course, you all are familiar with Zoom. Throughout the webinar today, please feel free to type questions or comments in the chat box, and we hope to address those questions and comments toward the end of the hour. And now I'd like to call upon Kyla Powers, my assistant, to talk to you about attendance certificates.
Thank you. So essentially, to receive a certificate of completion for this session, you will need to fill out a request form, and I will send the link to that form to you in an email along with the evaluation form link. So you should receive that either today or tomorrow. And when you get that email, go ahead and fill out and submit the form. And if you have any questions about that process, I will put my information in the chat.
Thank you, Kyla. Now, I want to say an additional word before I introduce Rabbi Harris. When we planned today's topic this summer, we could not have known how our global community would be impacted by recent events. And many of you who are attending this webinar are from outside of Oklahoma and are not familiar with our very strong Oklahoma interfaith community. I would just want to say Rabbi Harris and other strong, compassionate Oklahoma interfaith leaders have worked together for many years to create a wonderful, healthy climate and relationships that we're able to face complicated events together because we care about each other. And so today, a reminder to all of us to care for ourselves and also care for each other. With that, it is my great honor to introduce Rabbi Vered Harris, who became the spiritual leader of Temple B'nai Israel in Oklahoma City in 2012. She is the fifth rabbi to serve the congregation since its founding in 1903. Rabbi Harris's community work in Oklahoma City includes interfaith dialogue, guest lecturing, and multi-faith prayer services. At the temple, she enjoys serving with a professional and volunteer team offering religious education, pastoral care, prayer, and social action opportunities. Although she was born Jewish, her formal study of the religion did not begin until college. Through learning and living Judaism, Rabbi Harris has become more passionate about civil rights, more compassionate for those who suffer, more open to universal truth, and overall, a better human. I know you join me in welcoming Rabbi Vered Harris.
Thank you, Mary. It is a pleasure to be here, an honor to be asked, and I appreciate that very much. I do want to mention a word of Zoom housekeeping, which is that I am not paying attention to the chat or to hands raised or any of that this morning. I'm letting Reverend Hughes handle all of that. So please do know that if you're putting anything there, I'm not seeing it because I'm going to just focus on trying to look at you and hopefully feel like we have some kind of a connection from afar, as well as my notes for the presentation. The presentation about trauma-informed healing in Jewish history. So if there is something that the Jews know about, one of the things we know about is trauma. And there is this interesting question as to why are we still around? How have we dealt with the trauma of a few thousand years, healed and become a productive and hopefully meaningful, purposeful community around the world. So I want to look at this question through the lens of storytelling. I wish that that meant that I was about to launch into 40 minutes of telling you stories. That's not what it means. It means that I want us to think about the stories that we hear and how we tell them and our purpose for telling them. So right now, as Mary alluded to, we are acutely aware of the storytelling that's coming from Israel and Gaza right now, and people sharing their truths and their experiences. The stories that we tell, as well as how we tell them, these stories communicate the source of our trauma. Here's what happened to me. Here's why I am feeling trauma. Just the act of sorting through the story and how we tell it, the way that we verbalize, the narratives that we choose, it helps us to clarify, even in our own minds, what has happened and the way that it is impacting us. We can then use the storytelling as a way to help us identify what kind of comfort we need or what can bring us comfort based on the source of the trauma. So, God forbid somebody is facing the trauma of a loved one's plane crashing. It's probably not going to be a source of comfort for us to say, hey, let's get on a small airplane and fly out there right now. Oh, wait a second. What are the components of what happened that can help us to identify what might be comforting in this moment? And then the third part of that storytelling is that the comfort that we gain can help us to heal. And ultimately, that is, I think, what we are looking at is where does the trauma come from? Communicating the story. What brings us comfort in light of this trauma? And how can that comfort help to bring us to healing? I don't think of healing as everything's all better. I think of healing as scars for those of us who have physical scars on our bodies. Sometimes they itch, sometimes they hurt, sometimes they are unsightly, sometimes we cover them up. Sometimes people have these incredibly beautiful tattoos made out of scars so that it turns and transforms into something else. Healing is what we do with the scars and how we respond to the scars as they come back up, as they remind us of their presence. So there is a major day in Judaism of recounting trauma, and it is a time that is used for healing. This day is called Tisha B'Av, which literally means the 9th of Av. Av is a month on the Jewish calendar. Tisha just means 9. So the name of this commemoration is the 9th of Av because it takes place on the 9th of Av. Something to know about Jewish holidays and commemorations. We are not creative when it comes to naming things and to naming our holidays and such. On this holiday commemoration, which typically takes place in the middle of summer, sort of usually, so Jewish holidays can fluctuate on the Gregorian calendar up to about a month. So this is somewhere between mid-July when it's early and early August when it's late, quote unquote. So in the height and the heat of summer, we read the book of Lamentations. In Hebrew, the book of Lamentations is called Eicha. Eicha also happens to be the first word in the book of Lamentations in the Hebrew. Again, not creative with how we name holidays and our books of Torah or Tanakh. So this anniversary this commemoration marks the destruction of Jerusalem and the first temple in the year 586 before the Common Era by the Babylonians and the Babylonian exile. That is what the book of Lamentations is written about, presumably by the prophet Jeremiah, although it just depends on what lens we want to use for determining authorship. We also, on Tisha B'Av, or the 9th of Av, recall the destruction of the Second Temple in the year 70, and that is under Roman rule and Roman oppression for that first couple of centuries of the Common Era. Also on the 9th of Av, We remember the Alhambra decree, which required all the Jewish people to be gone from Spain by the end of July 1492, end of July, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av in 1492. We also remember the Edict of Expulsion from England, which was issued in July of 1290. July, Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. So there are all kinds of days of trauma that are recalled on this particular holiday. You know, we hear holiday and we think, oh, celebration. Not all of them are celebrations. I'm going to share a 4-minute video that explains a little bit more about Tisha B'Av to understand this cycle that I'm talking about storytelling, what brings us comfort, and how can comfort help us to heal.
Every major ancient holiday on the Jewish calendar, even Yom Kippur, is ultimately about joy, except for one, Tisha B'Av. On this day, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av, it's said that a series of major tragedies to the Jewish people occurred, including the destruction of the first and second temples. It's a day of mourning for getting kicked out of the land of Israel, for the destruction of Jerusalem, and the medieval expulsions from various lands. It's said that Tisha B'Av is the day when it all went down, literally. Sacred sites, entire communities utterly destroyed, leaving a gaping hole in our collective soul. When life comes crashing down, we're left devastated. We cry, we mourn, we feel isolated. All natural responses to loss. Tisha B'Av is a day of mourning when the Jewish people acknowledge that no, life is not all butterflies and roses, and yes, this tribe has been through some serious suffering. The time prior to this day is known as the 3 weeks. The period starts with a fast on the 17th of Tammuz, when the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE began, and intensifies during the last 9 days, when the walls were breached until the 9th of Av, when the ancient temple fell. The whole period is somber, and it's customary not to hold weddings during this time. Traditional Jews stop shaving, cutting their hair, and listening to music. During the 9 days, some also refrain from eating meat and drinking alcohol. The final day is Tisha B'Av, a 24-hour fast. In the evening, it's common to sit on low stools or the floor at synagogue and to hear the book of Eicha, Lamentations, chanted by candlelight. The book, traditionally ascribed to Jeremiah, brings readers on a graphic journey of the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. Silent sit on the ground the elders of fair Zion. They have strewn dust on their heads and girded themselves with sackcloth. The maidens of Jerusalem have bowed their heads to the ground. My eyes are spent with tears, my heart is in tumult. My being melts away over the ruin of my poor people, as babes and sucklings languish in the squares of the city. The melodies of the day are like a dirge, a time of reflection as Lamentations concludes, Hashivenu Adonai, turn us to you, Holy One, and we will return. Renew us as before. Following the reading, it's customary not to greet each other and to leave in silence, honoring the lives lost in the sacred space of introspection. When a dark history seems to follow an entire people around, it's only natural to ask why, or how could this be? Sometimes these questions are real, and sometimes they're more like a lament. Why me? Why us? How could this have happened? Eicha translates literally to how, as in, how could this be? Jewish thinkers have struggled to understand these questions for thousands of years. Historians see these as historical events where one nation overpowered another, but the rabbis understood them differently. In Hebrew, sinat chinam, baseless or useless hatred, was rampant throughout the land. The rabbinic tradition understood the loss of Jerusalem and the temple to be the divine consequence of the people's unethical behavior. That's why this day is also a time to consider improving our own words and actions in the world, especially how we treat others. Tisha B'Av comes in the midst of summer and yanks people out of that summertime and the living is easy feeling. The day invites Jews to turn inward and consider what it means to face national, spiritual, and individual darkness and loneliness. With a reflective heart, the next turn is outward, towards the light of life again, which renews a people's connection to God, to each other, and to the world. The spiritual turns of Tisha B'Av prepare the Jewish people for the biggest turn of the year, just 7 short weeks away, when the shofar calls our attention to Rosh Hashanah and the new year.
So there we see the cycle. Tell the story, do something that commemorates. For the example of Tisha B'Av, it's signs of mourning, and then turn back outward to say, I've been harmed, but what brings me comfort? Hope. So then what can I do to heal? Give hope to others and turn it back around and outside of ourselves, but not until we have gone to the depths of mourning. And yes, even for something that happened 2,600 years ago, almost 2,500 years ago, because it is part and parcel to how we understand the ebbs and flow of life, the cycle of now it's better for me, but that means that only means that because it's better for me, I can help it to be better for someone else, and the way that cycle goes around and around. There are other times of trauma where, so I'm taking us from the 6th century before the Common Era, and I'm going to bring us up into the 20th century, knowing, as I mentioned, there are lots of other things in between that have place in our storytelling as a people. And we have books and books and books of folk tales and all kinds of storytelling, but I'm going to fast forward us to other times of trauma, and in particular, Kristallnacht. And I chose Kristallnacht because it is November 9th and 10th. So it's coming up this week. Thursday night is the beginning of this commemoration, Kristallnacht, which was a night or a day, 24-hour period in 1938, when the atrocities of the Nazis became clear to when the cruelty of the Nazis started to become more apparent to the Jewish people of the time. Not the atrocities in terms of camps and murder and that piece, but this was the beginning of the end in some ways. So at least the beginning of the end of European Jewry as we knew it. So for those who might not be aware, before World War II, there were about 9.5 million Jewish people in Europe, and after World War II, there were about 3.5 million. It was about 2/3 of the Jewish population of Europe was killed during the Holocaust. 2/3. So if you think about whatever population you are a part of, whether that is your house of worship or your religious community, or if you think of it as the number of people who go to your alumni association, or that you're in Rotary with, or whatever the case might be, like choose a demographic and then have 2/3 of those people gone. It was the largest population of Jewish people in the world was in Europe. So by comparison, for instance, the United States had less than 5 million Jewish people at the time. So 2/3 gone. And I want to just take a look here at the way the U.S. Holocaust Memorial and Museum explains Kristallnacht and this idea of storytelling and whose stories we listen to and the way that they communicate the trauma. They ask us, where does your comfort come from? And then how do we use that comfort toward healing? So we're going to communicate trauma. So for those who are less aware, November 9th through 10th, Nazi leaders, 1938, Nazi leaders unleashed a series of pogroms against the Jewish population in Germany and recently incorporated territories. So 1938, remember that the Nazis were already going into other areas and overtaking the governments of other areas. Incorporated territories is what it's called here. A pogrom, the word pogrom comes from the Russian, and it particularly addresses slaughters, going in unprovoked into a community of civilians and slaughtering people, massacring people, brutally raping, as if there is another kind of rape, but raping people, all of the things, frankly, that we saw on October 7th, that was a pogrom, but this was in the 1930s. And it became called Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, because of the shattered glass that littered the streets after the vandalism and destruction of Jewish-owned businesses, synagogues, and homes. So that's, a lot of Jewish people had storefronts well, the glass was all broken and the fires were started, things were looted, et cetera, et cetera. So let's take a look at the storytelling here. First, before Kristallnacht, there was an assassination of a German diplomatic official, Ernst von Roth, which took place in Paris. He was part of the Nazi Party, and his assassination was the storytelling that the Nazis used to blame the Jewish people. And they basically said that it was justifiable. They said that it was spontaneous, the Kristallnacht actions, and it was an absolutely unprecedented level of trauma to the Jewish community under the Third Reich. Okay. During this pogrom, there were 30,000 Jewish men who were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. Now, we didn't know at the time really what the concentration camps looked like, but it was the first time that there was this massive arrest of Jewish people because they were Jewish, not because they owned a shop, not because they were against the Third Reich, not because, no other reason. You're Jewish, that's it. 30,000 rounded up. And after Kristallnacht, as a part of this storytelling that loops back to this was really the fault of the Jewish people because the Jews instigated it in some way and connecting it to the assassination, the Nazi regime ordered the Jewish community to pay 1 billion Reichsmark as an atonement tax. And then all the anti-Jewish laws and edicts started to flow after that. So this is a moment of great trauma, November 9th and 10th. We're going to listen to a first-hand account of it from the Sudetenland. And then talk more about it.
What I saw was hordes of people standing in front of our beautiful synagogue and throwing stones through these magnificent colored windows. And as we arrived, of course, we ran past the place itself, the noise, the shouting, the screaming. I suppose there was an aura of eeriness about it, because we still didn't know what was happening, but I suppose just the mere fact that so many people were there and were screaming and shouting and throwing stones into the stained glass windows was enough to make us run. We arrived in school and were immediately told that our parents would pick us up. We should remain calm, but there would be no school that day. And indeed, a few minutes later, or half an hour later, whatever the case may be, my mother did arrive and took me to my grandmother's home where my father already was. And here then unfolded slowly but surely the grim story of what happened during the night, that the synagogues all through Germany had been set on fire, destroyed. The Sifrei Torah were burned in most cases. It is known that in Hamburg, people sacrificed themselves to run into the synagogue to save some of the Sifrei Torah, hide them, and I believe were successful in doing so. That the Jewish stores in the center of Hamburg, in the downtown area of Hamburg, had been demolished. Windows had been broken. The merchandise had been thrown into the streets, covered with water and with ink. And I mean, it was a total chaos, a total destruction.
So that's an example of storytelling. Now, obviously, that video clip is pretty old now. We have very few survivors left who are able to tell their stories and their firsthand accounts. But that video clip that addresses the trauma that a child feels when the adults are in chaos, how adults have to tell the story to be able to both help children understand what's going on, but also not scare them so dramatically that the children themselves become unable to function. It wasn't so long after Kristallnacht that, for instance, I mean, I can speak secondhand for my grandmother in Czechoslovakia, that children were no longer able to go to school because they weren't welcome in the schools anymore. So how do you tell your child, good morning, you're not going to school today, right? So all of these early traumas that we know where it led now with hindsight, but that are compounded over time. So what does healing look like? So I want to mention that we have 3 survivor Sifrei Torah. Our speaker alluded to the Sifrei Torah. Sifrei Torah is the Hebrew for books of Torah or scrolls of Torah. It just means Torah scrolls. We actually have 3 in our congregation that are called survivor scrolls. One that was pulled from flames, one that we're not sure how it survived. We think it was already getting smuggled out potentially before Kristallnacht. We're not sure. And then another that was saved during the events of the 9th and 10th of November. We use these scrolls. We normalize not the trauma itself, but the idea that trauma happens and we survive and our values are not decimated because of the trauma itself. So one of the ways that we refer to the Torah in Jewish tradition is that the Torah is the tree of life. Well, you cut down a tree and it's not the tree of life anymore. So we continue to use these scrolls in our regular worship practice. We don't say, oh, today is a Holocaust Memorial Day, so for that we'll use the scroll. No. We use the scrolls in our regular rotation. We refer to them. We say this is a part of our tradition. Some of them, one of them in particular, has some pretty bad water damage that cannot be fixed, and in some communities would be deemed unfit for use because of that and the illegibility of the text in some places. But I've made the decision as the rabbi of this community to say, no, we use it. And if that means that we can't read from that Torah portion or that section of Torah because of it, then we'll read from another section. But we're cultivating and nourishing ourselves by cultivating and nourishing the tree of life itself, those Torah scrolls, telling their stories, understanding where we came from, and that these scrolls continue to teach us. Another example of the storytelling and what do we do and how do we deal with the trauma. This coming Thursday night, which is, like I said, the beginning of the commemoration of Kristallnacht, we're having an event at the temple, Leave the Lights On, which is in reference to the lights going dark in the synagogues in 1938, that we will have our lights on. And we're actually having a program with panelists from the Schusterman Center for Israel and Judaic Studies at the University of Oklahoma to discuss current events. And just as the speaker in that last video told a little bit of her story of what it meant for her father to sit them down and to say, okay, well, we need to open up about what's going on. So how we discuss the current events, how we tell the stories of what is the news that's coming out of Israel and the Gaza Strip today and the region today. What do we do with the pogrom from October 7th? How do we consider the Israeli response to it? And how do we consider our response to it as people in the Jewish community, not all of whom are Jewish? Just because somebody's in the Jewish community does not mean that they are Jewish, just as 20% of the population of Israel is not Jewish. How do we process our feelings and our thoughts and our realities about what is happening? Another example, which again, I said we're going to move into the 20th century, so this is another Holocaust-related example, but I do feel like it is, for better or for worse, the pieces of Jewish trauma that most people have some familiarity with. We have a commemoration on the Jewish calendar called Yom HaZikaron LaShoah, the Lag Vura, and sometimes you'll just hear it referred to as Yom HaShoah. So Yom HaShoah, which is the Holocaust Commemoration Day. It is not the January 27th day that's noted on the international calendar. The Jewish calendar, so within the the January 27th date, that's for the world and through the United Nations. But we internally, if you will, within the Jewish community, deemed the 27th of Nisan on the Jewish calendar as a day of commemorating the Holocaust. Why the 27th of Nisan? Nisan is the month of Passover. And it was during Passover that the Warsaw Ghetto uprising started. So sometimes you hear stories about, well, why didn't the Jewish people fight back? And aside from the naivete of saying that somehow the Jewish people could have conquered the Nazis, aside from that wishful thinking, there is the piece that there are Jewish people who fought back. And the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is an example of that. I'm not going to go into all of it. You can tell from the title, Warsaw Ghetto. So we're in the ghetto in Warsaw. Uprising, Jewish people fighting back during that time, ultimately defeated, but to have a moment of saying, we're not sheep being led to the slaughter. So this Memorial Day for the Shoah, which is the Hebrew or Jewish name for the Holocaust, and for the heroes, is based on after Passover, so as not to diminish or to compete with the celebration of Passover itself, but still in the same time frame, to remember the heroic acts of the people who fought back in any way that they could. So that might be physically fighting back, like with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or with the partisans in the forests. But it could also be the person who shared half a morsel of bread with somebody else in their camp just to try to keep them alive. It could be the person who somehow found out and remembered and figured out that it is this other person in the camp's birthday and did some celebration for that. It could be any number of ways that people were heroic in small and in big ways. So as a nation, what does this mean for storytelling? Well, first of all, just those stories that I just told you, those are a way of remembering that healing from trauma, resisting the decimation from trauma, it can begin with outlook and with individual resolve to still try to be a light in the world, even when we are surrounded with darkness. There is an ethic, I guess I'm going to say, with the way that Yom HaShoah is commemorated particularly in Israel, because as a Jewish state, it has the ability to have public commemorations that infiltrate, if you will, every part of life. So it is not a day off of work. There are Jewish holidays that are absolutely days off of work. Things are closed, just like federal holidays in the United States. But Yom HaShoah is not one of those. On Yom HaShoah, people are expected to go about their day. Children go to school. It's not like Memorial Day here in the United States where it's a day off of school to remember our fallen, but people go to school, people go to work, people run their errands. Everything is open. It is considered going on with our lives in a rebuilt Zion a tribute to those who are murdered. So we do this on this day of commemoration, aware that the very act of living in Israel is an act of our lives going on as Jewish people with self-determination in a way that is afforded to many other nations around the world. There are also ceremonies at the National Cemetery, and there are ceremonies all throughout the world. So I'd like to share a little bit of what this looks like, and if it's not clear from the video that I'm going to show, so I can explain it afterwards. Got to get myself out of full screen here, though. There we go. So this is a video taken on Yom HaShoah, and this looks to me to be Jerusalem.
Oh,
So 2 minutes of the sirens wailing. You can see other videos of this. All the cars start moving on the highways and everything just picks right back up. So it is a way of stopping to tell the story. You saw the little girls in the beginning of that video where, why are we, Abba, why are we doing this? Oh, well, let me explain. So a way to tell our story and then to go about our business as a part of healing from the trauma. There is this piece of compartmentalization. And sometimes it's necessary to say, this is the time, this is the day, this is the place where I'm going to compartmentalize my trauma and pain, remember it then so that I can function in the rest of my life. The siren reminds us we're not alone. When people stop on the highway, and you did see that there was a car and a motorcycle going on the highway, they're not going to get a ticket, they're not going to get pulled over. This is a social contract that we stop. So for those who choose not to follow the social contract, that's another conversation, but it's not illegal. For the people who stop, and sometimes they were on the side of the road, sometimes it's right smack dab in the middle of the road, people get out of their cars, they stand by the side of their car. It is not a Jewish custom to remove your head covering in prayer. I finally got the Thunder Game to stop asking people to take their hats off when we pray, because it is a Jewish custom to have your head covered during prayer. So it's not like people are taking off their hats and putting it over their hearts, right? Only when I give the prayer. They say it all the other times, but when I give the prayer at the Thunder Game, they've agreed to change the wording if it is your custom or something like that. I don't know. Anyway, so you know that you're not alone, that there are all of these other people who are also stopping, pausing, remembering. And what does that mean for trauma? That in and of itself, without a narrative, in and of itself is storytelling. We are in this together. I'll tell you, it is very odd, maybe, as a Jewish person, on our holiest days of the year, Yom Kippur, for example, our Day of Atonement, when many of us spend the entire day not only in synagogue, but fasting and praying and studying and totally off of screens, removed from the rest of the world. When a circumstance comes up that for some reason you need to leave during the day, it is so weird. You know, people go on with the rest of their lives on that day, holiest day of the year, and people are still going to the grocery store and doing all these things, right? So for those of you who might be Christian, if you bemoan that there are places that are open on Christmas Day, I can assure you that as a Jewish person who does not observe Christmas, more places are closed than open. But on our holiest day of the year, everything's open. And nobody even knows that it's going on unless they're Jewish. So there is nowhere in the world except in Israel where, as you know, an entire nation, things say, this is a holy day, this matters, you are not alone. So on Yom HaShoah, or Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Memorial Day, when everything is open and everybody's going about their life, to be in a place where, but now we stop. We have no comparison to that in our own country here. And it's quite a feeling of solidarity and the social contract of what it means to say, us living our lives, whatever they might look like, in and of itself is an act of healing and triumph. So there is time and place that communally, like I said, social contract is designated as holy. And we don't forget, we don't heal when we compartmentalize so extremely that we bottle something up into a little black box and bury it deep. That's not what I mean by compartmentalization. I just mean time and a place. So we don't forget, but we also do more than constantly remember. Can't every day, this is all I think about over and over again. This is the only story that I have to tell. This is all that I can't do that. In other words, we have to think about other things because we must live after our loss. We must live after the trauma. We have to create the world that the dead would be proud of. So speaking of the dead and not telling the same story, last week was the Yortzeit, the annual Jahr, coming from the German Jahr, year, the annual remembrance of my grandfather's death, Bernard Friedman. And I joined my mother and my aunt to light a candle. This is Jewish tradition, is that so we mark, in my family, we mark the Yortzeit according to the Gregorian calendar. So my grandfather died on October 30th. So the evening of October 29th, we light a candle and we leave that candle burning until October 30th when the sun goes down, as a 24-hour remembrance of the light of his soul. There is no particular prayer to say when you do this. You can if you want, but it's not like you have to say these words. So my mom and my aunt said that they told me last week that they usually talk to him and they talk about him when they light the candle. My family all lives out of town, so I don't typically get to observe Yortzeits with them. So I asked them, what do they say? And we just paused, lit the candle. While we were in the midst of getting ready for dinner, we paused, we talked to my grandpa for a minute. They told me what they say about him and to him, told a couple of stories. We teared up a little bit, and then we moved on with dinner. And his candle was there, his light was there, but it can't be the only thing that we did for 24 hours. So in Jewish tradition, we need a minyan, sometimes you'll hear, not the little yellow guys from the movies, but a minyan is a prayer quorum of at least 10 people who are who are Jewish and over the age of 13 plus 1 day. We need this prayer quorum in order to recite what's called the mourner's prayer. It is a prayer for mourners in memory of the person who died, but it doesn't talk about death. It only talks about praising God. But this emphasizes the fact that 9 people need the 1, and the 1 needs the 9. We are incomplete without this quorum of 10 people representing the community. It emphasizes that we mourn in community and that we heal with community. So when we come together in community and on a Shabbat service, wherever you live, a Sabbath service, wherever you live, if you ever watch a live stream of it, you'll hear that we say this prayer every time we have a Sabbath service, provided that there are more than 10 people present. And we read the names of those whose yortzites we are observing with this prayer. In some communities, and we just started doing this within my community, folks who are obligated to say the prayer for that particular recitation, because they are remembering somebody specific, are asked to stand first. What that does is that lets me see, oh, Vered Harris is observing a yortzeit tonight. Afterwards, at the reception, when we get together after our prayer service, I can go and ask a story. 13 years plus 1 day, I said I wasn't going to be looking at the chat, but I saw that pop up. That's the age of bar mitzvah. That is the age of majority in Jewish tradition when adolescents are considered religiously responsible for their own actions. If they show up, it is to their credit. If they don't, it is to their detriment. Their parents are not held responsible for their children's religious choices. So this idea of storytelling and being able to tell about the person that I am remembering, this idea of storytelling then includes personal trauma as banal as the death of a loved one. It happens to not every one of us is going to be running to bomb shelters. Not every one of us is going to be caring for somebody who has undergone a horrible diagnosis. Not everybody is going to have their house, God forbid, struck by a tornado or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But does everybody have someone they love die? Yeah, everybody does. So here, this is so banal, and yet still the community is called to be a part of it. And then, of course, we also have the communal trauma of massacres and wars and horrible things that go on a larger scale in our world, which goes back to some of those other commemorations that I mentioned, like the 9th of Av, Kristallnacht, and Yom HaShoah. So I want to summarize here so that I can or start to move into conclusion. So we designate days to remember. Compartmentalizing does not mean burying. We tell the stories of our loss, whether that's communal or personal. Some of us find comfort in prayer, and therefore we pray. And we ask how the trauma of the past can inform our current and future lives in positive ways. So my mother and aunt talking about what they learned from their father to pass that down to me passing it down to my children. Yes, it was so difficult on me when my grandfather died. That's a whole different story. My grandparents had a huge hand in raising me, but that's not the end of the story, because the story ends always in hope. So this is a way that brings healing to the world. We heal through the hope and through helping others with what we have learned. So I do feel compelled that I need to say something about us being in the midst of trauma right now. What can we do while the walls are falling down and the floor is shaking and the roof is on fire? All of that is both literal and metaphoric. And I think that it is relevant to share what is, I cannot, I guess, I'm not here to represent all sides of every story, but I do want to be able to at least share what's happening in some parts of the Jewish world, because we're not in a place of quite being able to heal right now. We are in a place of needing to figure out just the storytelling aspect. And my links broke while I have been talking. So let me pull these two up before I try to share screen for you. Here we go. So here's what we're doing right now for our storytelling, in a sense. This is from the Times of Israel. It's a really helpful online newspaper that shares news from Israel from an Israeli perspective. These are stories of those who have been kidnapped, those who were kidnapped on October 7th. There are over 200 people who are being held hostage or who we don't know what happened to them after the slaughter and the pogrom on October 7th. Some artists have put together some posters saying who has been kidnapped. And then in addition to that, you can see that the journalists from the Times of Israel are putting together biographies of each of the people who were taken hostage. So, and you can see presumed captive, etc. So they're trying to tell the people's stories. They're not trying to tell the stories necessarily of what happened on October 7th, although that is a part of it. They're trying to tell the stories of who these people are. Some of it does include text messages, etc., that they shared as they were being attacked and taken. The Times of Israel is also working on a similar project, not those we are missing, but they're working on a project of those we have lost. So these are civilians and soldiers who have been killed in Hamas's onslaught, particularly the pogrom on October 7th. There are over 1,400. They know that it's going to take them quite a while. You can see that so far they have 136, not even 10%. They've been working on it diligently, but not even 10% of the people who were killed. So we're already starting the process of trying to tell stories, and stories of people's lives and their hopes, people who were working for peace all of their lives, people who were at a party, who people are, so that we can say in this time of trauma, here's the story of the people. And when we have a chance to breathe, and now is not the time, but when we have a chance to breathe, okay, well, if I am mourning Ram Sela, what would have brought Ram comfort in trauma, this gentle giant, as he's reported to have been, or Anula Ratnayaka, who is Sri Lankan, and the memory of remembering somebody who was a Sri Lankan caregiver, not Jewish, not from Israel. What does it look like? What would have brought her comfort? And how do we honor her life? And can we gain hope and comfort from that which would have brought hope and comfort to someone else? And it is seeing ourselves as a part of the larger cycle of trauma, storytelling, and healing. So finally, we'll have a few minutes for questions. I just want to emphasize that from 586 before the Common Era, or for those of you who are familiar with the Book of Nevi'im or New Prophets, in my confirmation class, 9th and 10th graders, we've been reading from Judges. That's very eye-opening for them to see some of the slaughter that goes on there. And I do laugh often when I talk about traumatic things. That is a defense mechanism that I have. Sometime I'll tell you about my grandfather dying by falling off of a cliff, which my children are absolutely appalled that I laugh, but that's how I deal with it. Anyway, so healing, meaning looking forward with hope. So resilience helps to make the world better. So how do we make ourselves resilient? What do we need to do that, particularly when there's bloodshed and attacks on the Jewish people for thousands of years? There are museums, there's technology, there's agriculture, there's nonprofits, there's higher education, there's raising the bar for what it means to make the world better. All of these things are how, when you look at the story of the Jewish people as a whole, this is how we take the trauma and we tell the story of the pain, and then we create a narrative for improving the world. If you are familiar with the Genesis Prize is something that for generations takes remarkable Jewish leaders who have propelled humankind forward by discovering cures for disease, developing new technologies, composing musical masterpieces, advancing causes of freedom, human rights, and serving as trailblazers in countless other fields. That is a quote from the Genesis Prize's website. There are a number of films that highlight this, that say, okay, well, considering all of the trauma, what do we do to create hope? Well, that is something that is a story that the Jewish people tell ourselves. Here are the ways that people have done tremendous, inspiring, hopeful things throughout our history. And we hold this up as an expectation for ourselves and for the next generation. What are we going to do to make this world better? Because if we don't, then all of the trauma and suffering is for naught. I am going to stop there with 5 minutes for Q&A. And as Reverend Hughes said, I'll stay on for a little while afterwards once the recording stops as well for those who want to have an offline conversation.
Oh my goodness. Thank you so much for your wisdom there. There is one question from Nancy Woods. I have always wondered how rabbis helped people during the trauma of the suffering and death during World War II.
So thank you, Nancy. It varies greatly, but you can look up a woman named Regina Jonas, or more familiar to, I guess, our ears, Regina Jonas is how it's spelled, but the German pronunciation is Regina Jonas. Regina Jonas was the first woman that we know of in the 20th century ordained as a rabbi. She was actually killed in the camps, and so we don't it's really only recently that we've reclaimed telling Rabbi Jonas's story because, frankly, we had other things to worry about after World War II rather than egalitarian rabbinates. But there are stories about Regina Jonas and Viktor Frankl, a name that many people are familiar with, actually working together in the camps. He from a philosophical, psychological perspective, she from a pastoral perspective, of helping people to come into the moment of the reality of where they were and not knowing what would happen. When I say that it varies because each of us, even as rabbis, vary. So I definitely encourage you to look at the work of Regina Jonas and also the work of Viktor Frankl, and to know that largely the pastoral notion of caring for others, it transcends, and we do our best. But as my good friend, Reverend Mary Hughes, has reminded me, we as faith leaders also have to take care of ourselves. And sometimes that means that in order to be able to care for others in the deepest times of trauma, we need to disappear for a few days so that we can regroup and we're able to care for others.
Very well said. Well, we will put all of the links on the videos here that you have presented. We'll put that on the resource page. And this recorded webinar will also be there. What a wealth of knowledge our Rabbi Vered Harris provides to us. You know, sometimes the meetings after the meetings are the most rich and wonderful as we have conversation. And so we do invite those of you that can stay to stay after we complete the session at the top of the hour. But I also want to, before we do close, I want us all to say thank you to Rabbi Harris for your amazing resources. Those who had their cameras on are clapping and waving, and others I'm sure will be posting those thanks within the chat as well. I know that you join me in saying thank you to Rabbi Harris for not only her presentation today, but for her incredible leadership in the interfaith community. We need Rabbi Harris, and I cannot say strongly enough how important her influence has been within our interfaith community here in Oklahoma over the past couple of decades. So we do hope to see you next week, as well as we welcome Veronica Lejour, who is the Deputy Director for CARE Oklahoma. She'll be talking with us about welcoming the stranger and the Afghan resettlement and resiliency in the Oklahoma landscape, another wonderful interfaith partner that we have. And so at this time, I see lots of thank yous in the chat, but no other questions, I think, at this point. But we will close the video officially, and thank you all for coming, and we'll hope to see you next week. We'll stop the recording now.